So last week, I saw The Brutalist, and honestly, this movie kind of feels like one of the best movies I've ever seen. And I don't mean to exaggerate, but there's just so much this movie is trying to achieve thematically and symbolically, and I think the film achieves it all flawlessly. And in this video, I want to get into the meaning of every theme, every symbol, every major character, and every major scene from the very beginning to the very end of this 3.5-hour movie. So to break this movie down, we're going to use 3 themes. 1, the American myth, where we'll discuss the opening scene, the upside-down Statue of Liberty, the meaning of Part 1, the enigma of rival, Laszlo's cousin Attila, Laszlo dancing with Attila's wife Audrey, and Audrey's accusation. 2, resilience of brutalism, where we'll discuss the meaning of brutalism, the cinematography, the musical score, the social commentary, and the artists Laszlo is based on. And 3, the artist and the patron, where we'll discuss the character of Harrison Van Buren, the sexual assault scene, Erzsébet's character, the meaning of Part 2, the hardcore of beauty, the symbolism of Laszlo's brutalist building, Erzsébet crashing Harrison's dinner, and finally, the epilogue scene, and so much more. Hope you enjoy. Theme number 1, the American myth. I think the best way to begin deconstructing this enormously thematic film is to start with a quote from the writer-director Brady Corbet on the most overarching topic of the film. For me, it's just about the fact that every film about the American dream is about how people finally make it work. And I really wanted to make a film about the American myth and the American dream where it doesn't work and they have to leave. I mean, it's really as simple as that. And of course, Brady is speaking pretty loosely when he says it's as simple as that. The film is obviously not only about the myth of the American dream, but that myth of the American dream is the overarching matter of discussion in which the many sub-themes of this movie exist under. And the film immediately establishes this concept of the American myth with its introductory scene and introductory symbolic visuals. Right as the film starts, the audience is thrust into Laszlo's shoes, immediately experiencing the chaos of his circumstances and the desperation he feels to escape fascism for the freedom within capitalism. And we very clearly comprehend the level of sacrifice that he's making when we hear the words from his wife through a letter that she's written as he's leaving behind that wife and their niece as well. And through her words, combined with this opening visual sequence, we can very clearly tell that there's this burning sense of hope between Laszlo and his wife Erzsébet for a new beginning in a brand new country. And during this moment, since we also don't know where this fictional story is going, we too, as the audience, have this hope and optimism for this family to find a better life in this new country. However, symbolically, the dissipation of that hope is foreshadowed by the Statue of Liberty slowly turning upside down, all symbolizing the slow and unsettling reveal that the freedom, democracy, and hope that the Statue of Liberty represents may be a little harder to find in America than expected. And because, as Brady says, the American myth is such a major topic of discussion for this film, it's no surprise that this symbolic image of the upside-down Statue of Liberty is the main poster for the film. And now, by understanding this visual symbolism with this narrative foreshadowing, it makes perfect sense why this ice-cold intro drives us right into Part 1, the enigma of arrival. Part 1 of this film is named after the book Enigma of Arrival, written by V.S. Naipaul. It's an autobiographical book about Naipaul immigrating from Trinidad to the UK and other countries, including New York City and the United States. And I don't want to dive too deeply into this book, but the main theme of this book, The Enigma of Arrival, is to understand our preconceptions of a new country before immigrating, and how that preconception compares with our true experience of the new country once we are actually there. And when we observe Laszlo begin his new life in the US, this is exactly what he's experiencing. The rest of this film is Laszlo battling between his perception of what he hoped America would be for him and what he is realizing America to truly be for him. But even though Laszlo is conflicted internally in this way, his sense of pride and respect for his history, his culture, and his art remains indestructibly intact. And this character trait within Laszlo is a key component in understanding how immigrants identify with themselves once they are introduced to a completely different culture. And a great character the film uses to juxtapose and contrast against Laszlo to highlight that difference in identity is Laszlo's cousin, Attila. And I think Brady's words are the best to use to deconstruct the character of Attila and his relationship with his cousin Laszlo in the first quarter of this movie. Attila represents assimilation and someone who is not very confident about their point of view and the life they have sort of crafted for themselves. He has an accent he's trying his very best to erase. He has a past that he's doing his best to erase. Yet, he admires Laszlo so much, but he's also quite jealous of him. He's jealous of his ability to be an independent voice. So a lot of the film is also about these these characters that sort of resent him for his inherent ability. And Laszlo's obviously complicated and he's flawed, but he's never not himself. And in this interview, Brady goes on to explain how every gesture from Attila to Laszlo has this sort of double meaning. There's this element of love and compassion by giving him work and a place to stay, yet also there's this element of jealousy and resentment in his patronizing nature of his words and even his acts of generosity. And Brady also explains how Attila very easily buys into his wife Audrey's accusation that Laszlo made a pass at her, which he knows is highly implausible. And very clearly, this character of Audrey is the symbol of the young, beautiful, so perfectly put together American wife within the portrait of the American dream. Someone Attila deep down likes to see a new Jewish immigrant like Laszlo dance with. It's an act he encourages because it's an image he loves, and is also jealous of at the same time because of the side of himself he has erased. But sadly, when we really get to know who this gorgeous young American wife Audrey truly is, we learn she's someone who resorts to cruel and untrue accusations to get an immigrant out of her American house. Just another symbol of the darker reality underneath the beautiful image. Theme number 2, resilience of brutalism. Easily the most obvious theme in the film is the artistic culture of brutalism and the impact of brutalist architecture in the 50s. It's literally the title of the movie. And to anyone who doesn't know what brutalism or brutalist art is, I'd like to spend a little bit of time breaking it down to explain how the film uses it to convey its message. And I think it'll tie a lot of lingering ideas in the film together that you probably noticed in the movie and which we'll talk about very soon. So brutalism is a form of architecture that emerged in the 1950s, specifically among the aftermath of World War II, the same period of this movie. And the style of brutalism is surely one of a kind. It's meant to have this raw, rigid, blunt, blocky style to it, most often being built almost entirely out of concrete. And because of how war-torn so many European countries were in the 1950s, this style of architecture was prioritized because it was so much easier to finance. Concrete is cheap, and many living spaces can be securely constructed in close proximity for the countless individuals and families who have lost their homes. However, the architects who were hired to design these buildings weren't only approaching it from a practicality perspective like their funders. They actually had a message to send with their designs. Brutalist architects believed that this structure and appearance symbolized a new future. The embrace of raw, inexpensive material to build smaller, more uniform homes represented a society focused on equality and humanity, rather than extravagance and material possession. It's essentially this concept of moving forward into this idea of a socialist utopia. And the raw, stripped down, massive, uncompromising presentation represented the honesty, truth, strength, and non-performative nature of this forward-thinking, progressive, change-focused new society. And because of the unapologetic, uncompromising artistic style of these buildings, combined with the political message that they represent, these buildings have become the most socially, politically, and artistically polarizing forms of architecture. Those who preferred historical romanticism with more conservative views were very vocal about their distaste for the design of these buildings. And even as these buildings moved overseas, still people had the same sort of distaste, which wraps things around back to this movie. So now you'll really understand what Brady is saying here when asked about brutalist architecture in relation to his movie. I think it's the combination of minimalism and maximalism that I find really appealing. It's not middlebrow, it's very radical. For us, we're really thinking this is a very powerful visual allegory for how post-war psychology and how post-war architecture are intrinsically linked. So essentially what Brady's saying in this interview is that he's been fascinated by the history of brutalism and that the main character of his film is heavily inspired by some of the most pivotal and passionate brutalist artists. And more uniquely, even the style of this film is constructed like a big brutalist building. The 3.5-hour runtime, the lifelong narrative, and the large-scale cinematography immediately brand this film as a classic historical epic that's unapologetic in its political and thematic nature. The musical score includes some tracks with the most raw, clicky, clangy sound to them, reflecting the industrial, construction-like atmosphere, while also some tracks have this enormous instrumentation. The editing even often takes on these long takes, and then these super sharp and jagged cuts into the next shot or the next scene, a little bit like Martin Scorsese does in a lot of his films. So altogether, the film, from a technical standpoint, is trying to capture that same size, scale, scope, simplicity, and rough around the edges approach that a brutalist building would have. And on top of this, the film also makes the effort to capture the thematic message of brutalism as well. The fictional character of Laszlo was written as an amalgamation of many brutalist artists, matching their real-life experiences and ambitions, such as Hungarian-American architect Marcel Breuer, who experienced all types of conservative microaggressions from the community when he built St. John's Abbey and the Met Breuer, and was butting heads with his funders to maintain his uncompromising style, and also was providing new opportunities for others, for example, by employing the first black woman to be a licensed architect in America. So overall, you can see how Laszlo's character is written to reflect these historical brutalist artists who refuse to compromise with their collaborators and their community, all to carry forward this movement of social change and progress, which is essentially fueled by this irreversible pain and tragedy that these artists have witnessed and experienced firsthand. So let's get into how the character of Laszlo specifically demonstrates this through his relationship with his family and his funder in theme number 3, the artist and the patron. In many interviews, Brady talks about the negative effects of capitalism on the world and the inhumanity of those who are extremely capitalistic-minded, and how these extremely capitalistic people develop this psychopathic thirst for growth, possession, and ownership. And unfortunately, it's these kinds of inhumane people that end up running the world and having the most power, and the more humane people have to end up working and living within the limitations and structure that these inhumane people have set up. And the character relationship Brady uses to demonstrate this artist-capitalist dynamic is Laszlo and Harrison. And this is a bit of a long quote, but I think Guy Pearce himself does a fantastic job of deconstructing the Harrison Van Buren character. We get the sense that this is a man who, on some level, is ticking off boxes and kind of going, if I own this, if I'm successful at that, if I present myself this way, if I have these people around me, then I'm doing well in the world, and here's my identity, and this is who I am. And he's trying to live up to sort of an idealistic view that he has, which is, I suppose, on some level, this sort of capitalistic, you can be whoever you want. You can have whatever you want. You can live the dream, as it were. And the great irony, of course, is here's Laszlo arriving to make a better life for himself, but on a much more raw and honest trajectory, coming from real trauma. And in fact, actually has far more confidence in himself than Van Buren does. So on many levels, all of these things around Van Buren, like the big house and the big estate and the nice cars and the money, etc., the more we see of those, the more they show that the real Van Buren is kind of a weak man underneath all of that. And I think Guy's words here also do a really good job of allowing us to understand where the humor resonates with Harrison's character. I don't know about your theater, but with my theater, very clearly his character got the most laughs out of us. There's so much irony in what he does and says. In that very first scene where he storms in, he's incredibly angry, but that stems from a deep sadness. His monologue about signing that check for his grandparents, he's showing compassion, but in the most transactional way. And most notably, the way he works with Laszlo. He's generous, but in the most patronizing way, as if he almost has ownership over Laszlo. And all of this stems from this deep sense of insecurity and identity crisis. But because Harrison is funding Laszlo's project, there's an enormous amount of sacrifice Laszlo has to make to protect his artistic vision, at the cost of his salary, his time with his family, his livelihood, and even his sense of self-ownership. And most certainly, the most pivotal scene to capture this idea symbolically is the sexual assault scene. And I use the term sexual assault because I don't want my video to get flagged, but you know exactly the scene that I'm talking about. This scene symbolizes, in the most horrific way, how much Harrison's thirst for ownership exploits Laszlo's willingness to give up himself to protect his art. This is why, after this happens, Laszlo continues to work alongside Harrison. And to take the symbolism one step further, Brady Corbet sets this scene in Carrara, Italy. The marble found in those mountains in Carrara is a resource that has been extracted, abused, and exploited by capitalism to the point where it will no longer exist in the next few hundred years. Brady also describes the specific location of this sexual assault scene as the audience's descent into hell as we're traveling deeply beneath these mountains to witness the darkest side of humanity. And as we get further and further along in the film, we see that Laszlo is losing more and more of himself and his sense of self-worth, all for his project to faithfully represent his pain, his message, his history, and his hope for the future. And while this project is helping him heal and process his trauma, we have to ask the question at this point, at what cost? And with that question, that's where his wife, Erzsébet, comes in. And I think Felicity Jones herself gives a great explanation of her character. She's not physically present in the first half, but she has been talking about it as if it's a haunting. She's there in the ether, and she's obviously there in Laszlo's mind, and their love and their connection has helped them survive so much of what they've been through. You realize quite quickly that Erzsébet is not someone who's going to do what she's told. She has a very strong will, and she's defiant, and she's quite confrontational. And in some respects, it's quite difficult when they first see each other. They haven't seen each other in 8 years, and they're having to relearn one another. And I like how Felicity describes Erzsébet's absence as this haunting, because even though she isn't evil in any kind of way, there is this element of looming, longing presence that she has in that first half of the film, almost spiritually. And when she and Laszlo are in bed for the first time in the film, she says how she's been watching him the entire time for that first half of the film, where when she obviously isn't watching him, she just knows him so well that she's aware that he's been falling victim to his own vices. It speaks to the strength of their relationship and how he depends on her to maintain his own humanity and sense of self-worth. So while part 1, The Enigma of Arrival, focuses on false cultural perceptions and deceiving ideas of culture, part 2, The Hardcore of Beauty, focuses on the raw, truthful side of the world in all of its honest beauty. And this is why Erzsébet is the perfect character to be introduced to here. And as you probably were just thinking, the hardcore of beauty is the perfect way to describe the artistic culture of brutalism. And with that said, let's talk about what Laszlo's completed brutalist building actually symbolizes from Adrien Brody himself. Your experiences influence your work, and the traumas that Laszlo is contending with shape the structure that is an embodiment of himself. And the kind of walled-off areas and cavernous open space is kind of representative of the shell of a man he is. And yet, there is a spiritual heart and core to this space, and it speaks to the traumas of what he lived through and surviving a concentration camp, and yet his connections and hopes and dreams of connecting to God. And I'm sure, based on these words from Adrien Brody, you can very quickly and clearly visualize the high ceilings representing his feelings of emptiness, that marble center representing his inner spirit and self-love that he needs to protect, and that cross at the top representing his hopes to be closer with God. And it takes some time until Laszlo finally realizes through his niece and through his wife that to protect that inner self-love, that inner spirit, that hardcore of beauty, he and his family do actually need to leave the country. He's come to terms with the fact that the United States isn't everything that he envisioned it to be, and it's best for him to leave. And now he is no longer at the mercy of his abusive and exploitative relationship with Harrison. And this is exactly why Erzsébet, being the powerful woman she is, can now exercise the freedom of taking it upon herself to expose Harrison and his son for who they truly are in the middle of dinner with guests. And the cowardice within Harrison that Guy Pearce mentioned in his quote earlier is exposed and revealed when he immediately disappears from the scene. And finally, this moves us into the epilogue, where we have an older version of Zsófia giving a speech about Laszlo's legacy at an exhibition in 1980 in Venice. She describes Laszlo's inspiration for that Van Buren building, touching on some things that we've discussed in this video, but also a few new things, like it matching the dimensions of the concentration camp, and having these glass ceilings to symbolize the encouragement of free thought, and having these mirrors and secret corridors that symbolically connected him and his now late wife when they were geographically separated. And the final line from this older Zsófia as she looks directly into the camera is, no matter what the authors try and sell you, it's about the destination, not the journey. which of course is a play on the cliche, which is the other way around. And what this quote is essentially saying is that sometimes even if we're working on a passion project, the journey to complete that passion project may not be as pleasant as we may hope it should be. A lot of the time, it takes a tremendous amount of pain, exhaustion, and sacrifice just for that project to eventually come to life. And the sole reason why we're doing it when that process is so painful is to get to that destination where those brewing feelings can be released and that crucial message can be sent to the world. And this parallels Laszlo's journey in reaching his destination of the United States. He embarked on a very unpleasant journey, all in hopes of reaching a destination that would be worth it. And when he realized the destination wasn't much of what he hoped for, he had to leave because he doesn't have the luxury of reflecting on the journey in any kind of reminiscent way. A legacy of hope, progress, and change from a history of imprisonment, myth, and sacrifice. Laszlo has nothing left to give. All right, that's my analysis. I hope you enjoyed, and if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments and I'll answer them right away. Thank you so much for watching, and see you later.